morning, Murray. How are you?
Oh, Dirk, fine, thank you.
So it is, I think Jung might call it synchronicity that we meet each other on Labor Day to talk about Jungian analytical psychology in the workplace.
Very appropriate. Huh?
Yeah. How are you? Are you okay?
I'm okay. Yes, fine.
Yeah, super.
Yeah.
Nee, I still have so many fond memories of when we saw each other in ISAP and I was able to take your pictures at the Red Book
Yes.
Congress. And I must admit that I managed to buy quite a number of books from you. So I have Jung's Treatment
Okay.
of Christianity, obviously also the Map of the Soul. However, you also co-edited the Psyche at Work with John Hollwitz, and that's the book that I really, really would like to focus on, since it
Mhm.
covers two topics I'm really interested in: the world of work and Jungian analytical psychology. I really enjoyed reading the Psyche at Work, edited by you and John Hollwitz, and the reason is that I work in the world of business. And I think this world could benefit so much from the insight that you, John Hollwitz, and many of the others contributors shared in this book. So I guess my first question is, why did John Hollwitz and you decide to write a book about applying Jungian analytical psychology in the workplace?
Um, well, we didn't really we didn't set out to write a book. We designed a conference at the Jung Institute in Evanston, Illinois. It's just outside of Chicago. And this was in, I believe, the 1980s. And John Hollwitz was a professor at Northwestern University, and
Yeah.
he worked quite a lot in the business world, psychology and organizations. He's an organizational psychologist. And so he persuaded me to work together with him to set up a conference that would be attended, where the speakers would be from both sides, from psychology, Jungian psychology on the one side, and from organizational psychology in the business world on the other side. And so we had a collection of speakers. I think there were 8 or 10 of them. And from those, we made a selection to publish their lectures. And that's how the book came into being. And it was really my first exposure personally to the thinking about psychology in organizations and in the business world. As a Jungian analyst, I work with individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those individuals occupy many different kinds of spaces in the work world, some on the executive level, some on the other professional levels, and so on. Everybody, other than the retired people, are working, and most of them in some type of organization. So, in working with individuals, I, of course, also hear a lot about what goes on in organizations and the problems that arise, and psychological and social and class and all kinds of things going on in the workplace. So it was an opportunity to reflect on, in a larger sense, on psychology in the workplace. And so that's what you get in the book. You get various perspectives on this topic. Yeah.
Yeah. No, because one of my questions is that Jung did not seem to like large organizations. I mean, I looked up some of the things that he wrote about large organizations in his collective works, and I'll read you a couple of quotes. I mean, he says, for instance, the larger a community is, the more the individual will be morally and spiritually crushed, and as a result, the one source of moral and spiritual progress for society is choked up. Somewhere else, he says, every man is in a certain sense unconsciously a worse man when he's in society than when acting alone. And he also says, and finally, any large company composed of wholly admirable persons has the morality and intelligence of an unwieldy, stupid, and violent animal. The bigger the organization, the moral unavoidable is its immorality and blind stupidity. Now, the interesting thing, I always work my life with this one small exception for large and big organizations. So I can testify to the unwieldy, stupid, and violent animals that I've been a part of. But on the other hand, a key concept of Jungian analytical psychology is individuation, which you in the book also indicate is the same as spiritual growth. Now, could one not argue in favor of large organizations that they are excellent platforms, of could be excellent platform contexts, or even catalysts for individuation? They force people to interact with other individuals, often in a new and sometimes uncomfortable circumstances. So does individuation not need a context, and could those large organizations not be excellent platforms for this?
Could be, yes, could be. I think the person who works in a large organization has to make a decision, a basic decision about whether they're going to be true to their own instincts and values as an individual, or are they going to adapt to the culture that they have to work in. And so there are many stages of, or it's a spectrum from the person who's very intent on being an individual in the group to people who just swallow the culture whole and become part of it and become leaders in it and rise in it because they conform to the cultural mold. So when you say, could it be a place for individuation? Yes, it could, because it would force the individual to clarify values and thoughts and ideas and perspectives and ideology, belief, by coming up against otherness. We become conscious of ourselves by interacting with others and seeing differences. Consciousness requires difference to appear, so that you, if everything is white, you have no
contrast.
Yeah, you need the contrast. So what the organization can give you is a contrast. You have many individuals working in a collective setting. How do you fit in there? Do you or don't you agree with certain values and certain things that are going on? So it is a context where you can clarify your own values and position, and that moves you toward individuation. Individuation is a process for becoming aware of yourself as an individual. It has many levels and dimensions, but that certainly would be one, a social dimension at the level of persona and interacting with social systems. Yeah, I agree. It could be. Often it is so overwhelming, though, that the individual, as Jung says, is crushed. That is, individual consciousness is crushed. And one simply adopts groupthink and goes along with it until maybe there's a crash or something, burnout or something happens that forces the individual to take a stand against groupthink.
If you read the essay of Hollwitz, he says that organizations have inner psychological lives, apparent in collective symbols, ritual behaviors, and a cultural narrative. And it's interesting because more books have been written about the topics of, the so-called personality of organizations. I have here, for instance, a book of Corlett and Pearson, and the title of the book is Mapping the Organizational Psyche. So my question is, do you believe organizations have a unique identity, which is kind of, different from the sum of identities of the individuals that form part of the organization?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know about unique. That's a pretty strong statement. A unique identity,
or let's say different. Yeah,
they have an identity that is more than the identities of the individuals. Individuals join and leave organizations. Organizations go on. A corporation has an infinite lifespan. It has many individuals active in it at any particular time, but they come and go. But the identity of the organization, that is its sense of it, sense of itself, its what it stands for in the world, what it means in the collective, is beyond the sum of the individuals working in it at any given moment. You take an organization like Ford Motor Company, for instance. It's had many presidents, it had many workers, but Ford Motor Company, founded in, what was it, 1910 or so, has a very definable identity as a feature on the collective landscape. Everybody knows it. You think when you think Ford, you think a certain level of automobile, vehicle, trucks, and so on. Mercedes has an identity that is very, German and high level, high quality. So the organization creates an identity usually in its early years, and that is then, if it's a successful organization, that is maintained by the individuals who come into it and leave it over time. It's transcendent. The identity of the organization, you could say, is transcendent to the individuals, the sum of the individuals working in an organization at any particular moment. We have the same thing in Jungian organizations. With Jung Institutes, I've been the president of several of them, and presidents come and go, but the identity of the institute remains over time and continues with new individuals coming into it.
Yeah, I think that's a very true point. I think as a sociologist myself, I always learned that, let's say, organizations at a certain moment start to lead a life of their own. I mean, an example or a case in point is an Olympic committee that was formed in the Netherlands when the Netherlands was doing a bid for the Olympic Games. We basically lost the bid, but the organization kept continuing to exist because the members thought it was so meaningful to meet each other and to, let's say, explore common interests. So while the case for the organization had completely disappeared, the organization happily seemed to live after. The other question is, do you also think that the identity of an organization can change over time, and what would it require, and how would that take place?
Well, you think of what does you also ask, what does this identity consist of? I think there are myths and symbols are involved in the identity of organizations. Starbucks has a particular symbol that is recognizable all over the world. I was in Hong Kong and saw Starbucks years and years ago. We have Starbucks in Zurich, Starbucks all over the United States. Russia has Starbucks, and always the same symbol. It's a Melusina symbol, which is a classic mythological image, seductive. Come here, it seduces you to come in. You can lose yourself in Starbucks and have all kinds of adventures and so on. So you have myths and symbols. Sometimes with countries, you have animals. America has the eagle. Russia has the bear. You have flags. So this identity is a complex thing made of myths and symbols. And then you have myths of origin. A country like Switzerland has the myth of William Tell. America has the myths about George Washington never telling a lie, and so on. And then the monuments and the statues, the Statue of Liberty, So this does not, once it's set in place, it doesn't change over time very much. Now the country can change. For instance, the United States is going through a huge transformation these days in its politics and its economics, going through a very turbulent time. And one doesn't know, will that change the identity of the totality of the country? It's certainly being called into question. What is the meaning of this country? And so that happens in organizations from time to time. They can go through a crisis period and perhaps lose their identity and collapse, and then reform in a new way. But once the identity of an organization is set and it has its myths and symbols, short of a collapse and a total reorganization, I don't think it changes very much. The identity doesn't change very much. It's a bit like a dinosaur, it takes a form and then it just keeps on going until it becomes extinct.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think history has shown that, let's say, most of the time, if, let's say, organizations need to change, then it's most of the time it's a very strong input from the outside in terms of, completely changing market conditions or a crisis of any sort of kind to basically make an organization reflect and change. It's rare that, let's say, forces in the organization itself, mobilize enough power and energy to change.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I always find interesting is because one of my passions, and that's also something I'm deeply, deeply involved in, is leadership development.
Oh,
And
yes.
in reviewing leadership, Jung stresses the need for self-reflection. He says so-called leaders are the inevitable symptoms of a mass movement. The true leaders of mankind are always those who are capable of self-reflection and relieve the dead weight of the masses, at least of their own weight, consciously holding aloof from the blind momentum of the mass in movement. What do you think the consequences could be for leaders who are not capable of self-reflection, and how could it manifest itself in the performance of their organizations?
Well, Jung makes a contrast. He creates a contrast between so-called leaders and true leaders. Okay. I think what he has in mind there, so-called leaders, I don't know when he wrote this. This is from his collected works, 10.
Yeah.
Of that. It could have been after the Second World War. During the 20s and 30s, 40s, Europe had the so-called leaders, the dictators, and Jung commented on them quite frequently. And these are what he is referring to as so-called leaders, inevitable symptoms of a mass movement. In other words, they're part of a mass movement and they appear to be leaders, but they're actually, like somebody said, if you want to be a leader, find out where the mob is going and get in front of it.
That's a very interesting statement. I will remember that. Yeah.
Leader. And that's, you could say Donald Trump is that kind of a leader in the United States. He didn't create the base that is now following every word he says, but he tuned into a situation.
A movement that was already ongoing, yeah.
Yeah, and then he became a leader of it. So that's the so-called leader. Now, the true leader, what Jung has in mind there are people like Buddha, Moses, and Jesus Christ, and so on. Maybe also some modern prophets like Nietzsche, who was very fond of Nietzsche. They stay, they relieve the dead weight of the masses, at least of their own weight. In other words, they don't burden history with their own weight. They carry their own weight, and they hold themselves aloof from mass movements. This was also Jung's situation. He was a leader type. Whenever he joined an organization, they would always make him the president of it. He joined psychoanalysis in its early years, and Freud called him his crown prince, and he became the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, from which he then resigned after a few years because he didn't like what was happening in that organization, and he wasn't in agreement with it. So he individuated. He left the organization. Then later he joined another international medical psychotherapy organization that was based in Switzerland and Germany. And he became the president of that in 1933. When Hitler took power and the previous president resigned, it was a German. Hitler scared a bunch of people out of that organization, and because Jung lived in a neutral country, they elected him president. And he led that organization until 1939, very controversial on his part. So he was a leader type. He was a big man. He had a big personality. On the other hand, he didn't want to claim political leadership particularly. He was more of a spiritual leader. Philosophy and his reflections on history and transcendence and spiritual life and so on. He was more in line with those kinds of leaders, reflective leaders, as he calls them. So this ability to self-reflect isn't a quality that you usually find in organizational leaders. Organizational leaders are more the so-called leaders. They're people who have discovered what is the spirit of this organization, and found a way to step into a leadership role in that organization without giving that organization necessarily a new direction or a new vision. They take over an existing organization and adapt and adopt its identity, and they stand for that organization and they represent that organization to the public. So the president of Ford Motor Company isn't going to change the name and the emblem and so on of the Ford organization. He's going to represent that organization as best he can, and try to make it a successful, business in a very competitive world. The same thing, Credit Suisse has recently gone into a nosedive and collapsed and is now taken over by another bank. The leadership of Credit Suisse is being heavily criticized by the press and by analysts who are looking into their leadership of that company. And the claim is, and I don't know the details about this at all, but that the leaders did not lead the company in a manner that provided for the survival of the company. That's the first job of a leader, to make sure his organization survives, hopefully thrives, but survival is the first issue. And if you take too many risks, or you're caught up in a mass psychology that has preceded your quotes leadership, and you just join in, and you take it into a dead end, which is what happens occasionally in big organizations. So the self-reflection of a leader is a rather high level demand or requirement for true leaders. That would be a leader who really can, on the basis of some new information or intuitions or deep convictions, can actually take a organization onto a new road, or into a somewhat changed direction. Obama was in Zurich, I think last weekend, And he was asked a question that I just read about this in the papers. What was the most surprising thing that he discovered when he became president of the United States? And he said, it was very interesting, he said he discovered what a huge and powerful organization he had stepped into, the leadership position of. He didn't realize the complexity and strength of the American government, its military, its bureaucracy, all of its systems. And that was a big surprise to him, stepping in as leader. And he said leading an organization like that is much more like trying to steer a huge ship on the high seas than it is, sailing a small sailboat where if you're the captain, you can change direction very easily. You just, change the sails and the tiller and off you go in another direction. Changing the course of a huge ship on the high seas is a very, very slow and difficult process. And he felt he failed in many ways. And probably every president of the United States does fail because it's such a huge, massive organization that no one leader in his 8 years in office can make a very big difference. And I would say Obama is very self-reflective. Of the presidents I've known in my lifetime,
Yeah.
I put him at the top as a self-reflective personality. He thinks deeply. He's very careful in his decision-making. He's not easily taken in by other people's opinions. He's a reflective man. So it's still the limitations of leaders and leadership is, depending on the size of the organization, quite significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is perhaps a very, very difficult question, but Murray, what would you recommend leaders who want to develop their self-reflection to do? What are practical ways in which they could basically work on their self-reflection?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is going to analysis.
Yeah, I was thinking you would say that. Yeah.
What analysis is a an exercise in self-reflection. The analyst doesn't tell you what to do. He asks you questions and you reflect. And you reflect on yourself. Now, I don't know that would help an organization all that much. What self-reflective, let's say a reflective leader would do is reflect on the organization. And I've worked on occasion with people who are, business coaches or executive coaches. And they work with the executives on reflecting on their leadership style, on their ability to create teams, to distribute responsibilities well without losing their leadership position, and to take time to reflect on not only the financial interests of the organization. This is in the business world where everybody wants to and needs to make a profit and so on. It's in our capitalist system. If you don't make a profit, you go out of business. So it's a requirement of leadership to take that into account. But not only that, and I think things have changed fairly significantly in the last decade or two, that business leaders are also taking into account social responsibility, where they have their factories or they have their business operations, that there is a community outside of their organization that they have some responsibilities to, and to pay attention to that. And so that type of reflection, I think, can be facilitated by a good executive coach if the leader is willing to do that. Now, the executive coaches I've worked with also tap a bit into what we do in analysis, that is personal reflection, and an attempt to discover what are the complexes in the leader's personality that influence or bias his or her judgments. You know, we all have complexes. We have a mother complex, we have a father complex, and that these complexes create disturbances in our consciousness, and they influence us to take certain courses of action or to stay away from certain types of challenges. And sometimes these are good little warning signals, stay away from that, you know where that goes, or they can be detrimental because you might need to face that particular challenge in order to thrive or even to survive. And if you stay away from it, you land in a more dangerous situation. So to reflect on their own personal complexes and their personal history and how that might influence their leadership of the organization, the kinds of people they choose to work with them, the kinds of initiatives they choose to take or stay away from, the kinds of risks they're willing to take or not take, and to include that in the self-reflection, which I think is a significant step beyond what is usually taken to be executive coaching, to actually also include the personality of the leader in the reflection. But that takes a particular kind of skill and maybe some training in psychotherapy in order to feel comfortable working at that level with a leader, an executive.
Yeah, exactly. Because that was one of my questions. Because as you already alluded to, executive coaching is a very popular concept in business nowadays, and more leaders at all levels of organizations are receiving coaching to increase, especially the effectiveness of their behavior, in the
Yes.
hope that this, increased individual performance will lead to let's say a higher performance of their organization. And typically, let's say executive coaching lasts shorter and usually stays more at the surface than in-depth psychotherapy using, for instance, a Jungian approach.
Yeah.
What do you see in general? You already touched on it a little bit, but what do you see in general as, let's say, as the possibilities and limitations of executive coaching for individuals and organizations?
Well, I think one limitation would be the limitation of the coach. You know, the better trained the coach is,
Hmm.
um, the more possibilities and depth the coach can offer to the client. So I would say the first thing to focus on would be the training of the coach. Um, I'm not in that business of training coaches. I wouldn't know where to start with that, but they would obviously have to have some training in organizational psychology and so on, but also maybe some training in counseling, depth counseling, and even psychotherapy. Executive coach isn't a psychotherapist. That isn't the objective of an executive coach, as I understand it. But understanding of some psychotherapeutic principles like projection, um, uh, complex enactments, shadow awareness. You mentioned embracing the shadow, becoming aware of the shadow, and what the personal and the collective shadow of an organization might look like, and how to engage with that, how to become conscious of that. So I think the better trained the executive coaches in these areas, the further they could take the client.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it also depends on the capacities of the client and the openness of the client to engage in some deeper reflections. Some clients are very interested in going there, and others really want to stay away, avoid it at all costs. They don't want to touch it. You start asking them more personal questions about their interpersonal relationships, their history and their family dynamics, so on. They really shy away from those kinds of reflections. So it also depends on the willingness of the client to engage in some personal work, as well as willing to really look into what we call the shadow of organizational life, which sometimes takes a pretty strong, stomach. If you look at the history of organizations and what some of the damaging things they've done in the past, and you want to take some responsibility for that and take that on board and become conscious of it, you might have a pretty tough time convincing other people in the organization that that's a good idea. So I think it really depends on two things: the ability of the executive coach to take the client there, and the willingness of the client to go there into these areas.
Do you think psychotherapy and executive coaching could be complementary? So, for instance, if someone would be in analysis, let's say, to really deep self-reflection and working on this individuation, and on the other hand, let's say, receive a more instrumental coaching from an executive coach, do you think that combination could work, or do you have an idea that all kind of undesired interferences might occur?
Well, I think it could work. I think it would depend again on the coach's comfort level with that, and on the analyst's comfort level with having another, sort of person engaging in this type of reflection. But I think it could work quite well. Yeah.
Super. And another question about leadership is that Jung also wrote about the limitations of leadership. He says human leadership being valuable, the leader himself has always been and always will be subject to the great symbolic principles, even as the individual cannot give his life point and meaning unless he points his ego at the surface of a spiritual authority subordinate to man. My question is, which symbolical principles do you think Jung would refer to, and how do you think that could manifest itself in the world of business?
Well, I would think of the corporate myth
Mhm.
as being a symbolic principle. That would be something to reflect on in executive coaching. What is the corporate myth? What is a myth? It's a story. It's a narrative. When you go out into the wider world, what is the story you tell about your company? It has to do with its history. It's probably its founder, the ideology of the company, the way the company thinks about itself and about the world. And these are symbolic principles that in one way limit the leader, because he's stepping into something, or she, today it's certainly both.
In a bigger narrative, yeah.
They're stepping into a bigger narrative, and
Yeah,
they're limited by that. On the other hand, if they know what it is, they can also use it effectively.
true.
And they aren't totally controlled by it. You can also, reinterpret myths, and you can make them more suitable for your time, which I think leadership also does. It's something we also do in analysis. Somebody brings you a dream, and they've got an interpretation of it, and the analyst can offer another interpretation of it that brings another perspective. So leaders can reinterpret the narrative and give it perhaps a more contemporary meaning, or an extended meaning, a broader meaning. So they can work with symbols.
I agree. That's a very interesting thought, Murray. But you probably also, you already mentioned a couple of examples, but let's say the business world in the last decades have been plagued by large corporate scandals, right? If you think, for instance, Enron and WorldCom, who had accounting scandals, Facebook with Cambridge Analytica around, let's say, various election campaigns with data leaks and abuse of personal data. If you think about car manufacturers with diesel emissions. So my question is, if and how could embracing their shadow help organizations and business leaders to perhaps prevent these kind of scandals?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by embracing the shadow. What we do in an analysis, if that's comparable, is try to become aware of the shadow. And becoming aware of the shadow is the first step to taking remedial action. But if you're not aware of the shadow, and that it is shadow, if you sweep it under the rug, then you don't have a chance to make any changes or prevent some negative outcomes. You're just enacting shadow. And that's the problem with a lot of these businesses. They look the other way. In a sense, they know it's shadowy, and they know it's, very, the profit motive, for instance, creates huge shadows because, you sell opioids to people in pain, and you brush under the carpet the fact that opioids, if they're taken for more than 2 or 3 days, become highly addictive and will, in the end, kill the person. Okay, you just brush that under the carpet because of the profit motive. So you aren't embracing the shadow. You aren't looking at the shadow. You're sweeping it away. You're looking the other way. A shadow falls behind you. In order to see your shadow, you have to reflect. You have to turn back or ask somebody else about it. What do you see behind me? Do you see that I'm doing something that is contrary to the interests of the health of the client? In the case of the doctors, my wife went to a doctor some years ago with severe back pains, and he refused to give her pain medication for it. He said, it'll get better in about 6 months. Just live with it. To this day, we bless him.
I can imagine. Yeah.
At the moment, we cursed him because the pain was severe. But had he given her opioids, she'd be in a grave today. These are the shadow aspects of organizations that, or the insurance companies who benefit from prescription drugs. I had a psychiatrist friend who would be taken out to dinner by the salespeople from a pharmaceutical organization. Very expensive meal, and under the table they'd slip him an envelope with some $100 bills for a little thank you note, and so he would prescribe their drugs. So this is shadow. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, a leader of an organization takes note of that shadow and understands that shadow, and then asks the question, should we be doing this? Is this a good idea to do this? Is this in the long run interest of the client and the organization? That would be the first step. Now, you can, once you're aware of the shadow, you can make the decision to go on pursuing the same course of action as you have in the past, but doing it consciously. Okay, we're aware that we're going to make these people dependent on opioids, and we're willing to do that. Can you do that in good conscience? Well, if you can, maybe you're a sociopath or a psychopath, you can get away with it. But at least it raises the issue, and that issue should be discussed in the organization openly. And when it's discussed in the organization openly, then you start a reflection process that can lead to change, and taking responsibility for the actions. And I'm sure if that had been done at Volkswagen with the emissions, if that discussion had been taken into the into the board of directors openly and discussed as a real issue and not hidden away. This just, it's a small problem. It won't create it. That's wrong. And if those directors had known about it, they probably would have said, no, we can't do that. So embracing the shadow means making it conscious, bringing it out into the open, looking at it clearly, and then making a decision.
Yeah,
We call it
because
shadow awareness.
yeah.
Shadow awareness.
Yeah, because what I always find so fascinating, and I work with a number of companies who went through those scandals, is, and that's what I find so fascinating and strange at the same time. It's always a short-term play.
Yeah.
Because eventually, it comes out, and it's also predictable that it comes out. So it's really the question: what drives people, highly developed intellectual people, to play short-term games that they should rationally know, will come to an end, or to become known to the public soon anyway.
Yeah, you can become shadow possessed.
Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah.
It takes over, and it distorts your consciousness. You aren't thinking clearly anymore. There's a famous story in the Bible, the story of Cain and Abel, and Abel's sacrifice was accepted by the Lord, but Cain's wasn't. So Cain is sitting in his tent sulking, and the Lord comes to him and says, "Why are you sulking? Evil is sitting at the flap of the tent and waiting to eat you. But you can overcome it. You can overcome it." So the Lord tells him about it, but he steps out of the tent. He's taken over by evil. He takes his brother out into the field and he murders him.
Yeah.
This is called shadow possession. Even if you know it's there, you can be taken over by it. And that's the short-term gain mentality. We know it's there, but we can't stop it. We can't help ourselves. We can make such a good profit, or we can get our revenge against the other companies, and it's like a state of possession. That's a psychological problem.
Yeah.
And maybe a coach could help them there, sit in on the meeting and say, hey, you guys, you aren't thinking clearly. Something's gotten into you.
Yeah.
Greed. Revenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a very, very sobering thought, Murray. Yeah, and I would agree with you. I've seen cases like that. Another area, basically, if you look at, it's a completely different area of the application in Jung in the business world. And one of the widest applications of Jungian analytical psychology in the business world is the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs type indicator instrument. It's, for instance, used in assessments and job interviews. However, in the last decade, the validity of the instrument has been called into question, and the criticism centers around the forced choice psychometrics, type versus trait personality test, inconsistency of the test, etc., etc. So there's more and more discussion about it. What is your personal perspective on MBTI as an instrument?
Well, I think it used correctly, or used it's like all tools. In the right hands, it can be useful. In the wrong hands, it's dreadful. If you put people in boxes and say that's what you are and that's what you can do, it's wrong. It's what Jung and Myers-Briggs is based on Jungian, Jung work on psychological types. And what Jung was trying to do was, he said, create a critical psychology. So you respect differences. People assess problems differently. They come up with different solutions. They think differently. They approach life differently. And so he has the 4 functions and the 2 attitudes. And used correctly, that's useful. Myers-Briggs is a little bit too categorical, puts you in a box. But if the Myers-Briggs is used with a light hand, it can bring about some reflection, let's say. It can bring about a sense of diversity. People are different. They think differently. They approach life and problems and solutions differently. And we can respect those differences and benefit from them. No one function or one attitude covers all of reality. So the more input you get from the different functions and the two attitudes, the better your grasp on reality is. So if you build an organization with just, quotes, one type, it's going to be very one-sided and it'll probably fall over. You want a broad base and you want different kinds of input. So if it leads to tolerance of difference, then it's a very useful tool. I had a friend who said that Jung should have been given the Nobel Peace Prize for his book, Psychological Type. It's the greatest treatise ever written on tolerance. That was his view. It helps you tolerate differences and understand them and appreciate them and be able to work with them. And so it can be very useful as the beginning. I would say Myers-Briggs is the beginning of an understanding of typological differences and valuing different approaches and being able to use difference instead of insisting on one's own way exclusively.
Yeah, I would agree with that because I'm also certified in Myers-Briggs by the organization they founded. So in that sense, MBTI is close to my heart. But what it always enabled me to do was to have just deeper conversations.
Yes.
With potential candidates. It's not. I mean, I've never used it for a criterion in the sense of, you are this particular type, so therefore you don't fit what we're looking for. But I more think, well, it's interesting because your profile seems to suggest that in these type of situations you would act in a certain way. Do you recognize that, and can you make examples? So I always find them, enriching the conversation.
Yes, there's another platform called what is it? I can't think of it now. James Johnston came up with the use of connecting typology to individuation and to psychological development. Gifts Compass, it's called Gifts Compass. You can Google it.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's has the advantage over Myers-Briggs in that it does attach typology to challenges to individuation. So you have certain more developed functions and attitude. That means you need to work on the less developed ones, and it gives you a perspective on doing that. So I think as a tool for increasing individuation prospects, it can be quite useful.
I agree. Finally, Murray, I have a generic question for listeners who want to learn more about Jungian analytical psychology. I mean, and I already referred it to a couple of times, your book, Jung's Map of the Soul, is universally regarded as one of the best introductory texts about Carl Jung's thinking. And it also inspired, for instance, even a K-pop band, BTS, by the way. And I would, I really enjoyed reading it because of its clarity and succinctness, and can highly recommend it to anyone interested in understanding more about Jung and Jung's world. What was your motivation for writing such, let's say, an accessible, succinct book for a broader audience, Murray?
Well, originally it was a set of lectures I gave at the Jung Institute in Evanston, Illinois, called Jungian Psychology, A Deeper Look. And it was to a general audience, and I wanted to give them an appreciation of the complexity and the value of Jung's psychological theory. And I got the title from Jung's self-identity as an explorer. He thought of himself as exploring an unknown continent, the inner world. And you can see him doing that in his writings, also now in the famous Red Book, his active imaginations in the course of his midlife crisis. And it was like the discovery of a new continent. And that's the way he presented his discoveries of the unconscious and its various levels and depths and contours, its mountains and valleys and so on. And so he, in my mind, he mapped the inner world, or the world of the soul. And I wanted to make that available to a more general reading public. I took those lectures and revised them and made the book. Jung is quite difficult to read for most people. And the collected works, 18 volumes, pretty dense writings, and then a lot of other material. So I tried to condense all of that into a understandable roadmap. Now, I want to say, too, that reading the map is not taking the journey, so you can get a sense of the inner world, but it's very important also to discover it for yourself. And that's where, analysis, doing active imagination, working with your dreams, all of that comes in, that you have the experience of this territory that we call the inner world or the soul for yourself.
And what type of readers did you hope to attract, Murray?
Well, I would say fairly serious readers. I mean, it's not a simple book or an easy book. I hope it's readable.
It's very readable, and that's the reason why I really like it. I mean, it takes incredibly complex, givens and concepts in Jungian thinking, and it translated into, let's say, what I would say almost the most accessible way possible. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. I've heard similar testimonials from people. That was my goal, to not to simplify, but to describe Jung's theory in a way that is accessible to an educated, say, university-educated person, or a person who really has an interest in psychology and the inner world, and without creating too many obstacles, but hoping to entice them into going further in their own inner explorations also.
Thank you so much for your time, Murray. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I learned a lot from it. And I'm sure a lot of people who will listen to the podcast learn from it as well. I think the way that you connected Jungian analytical psychology to the current business world and leadership has been very, very enlightening for me. So thank you so much. Murray, before we end this interview, are there any, let's say, any final thoughts on your side? Any things that we have not discussed and which you consider to be important to stress in this triangle of Jungian analytical psychology, the business world, and leadership?
Well, the only thing I would say is that I think it's important for people to find their own North Star. If you're a mariner on the open seas, you've got to keep your eye on that star so you know where you are and get a sense of direction. So to find that is what we call finding the self, an inner source of wisdom and guidance that isn't overly influenced by organizational mentality or culture. We're all influenced by these things, but to have a sense of inner guidance that even goes beyond those to guide your own personal life, I think that is what's so important to discover at some point in your life, and get a good telescope and fix your eye on that star as you make your way through the turbulence of life.
Thank you very much. I think that is great guidance. Thank you so much, Murray.
Okay, Dirk, it's been a pleasure.